The Talking the Library series, just a little bit of background, was endowed by alumna Mary Teft White, who graduated from Roger Williams. I believe she was in her 70s when she graduated. She's the oldest, the oldest person to have graduated from Roger Williams. And she endowed this series with the hopes that students could hear from people who are involved in interesting and engaging careers, and also for students to get a sense of how people found their way to what they do and the kinds of things people do in that work. Along with that, I'll encourage you to join us on November 14th for our last one of the semester with November 14th at 3:30 with Johar Ilham, who is a Uyghur activist and daughter of political prisoner in China, Ilham Tohti. And she will talk about her experiences advocating on behalf of her father, her people, as well as making a life for herself as a political dissident in the United States. But today, we welcome Scott Busby. I want to mention that Scott has been a tremendous friend to Roger Williams, even though this is the first time he's been to Roger Williams University, particularly in regard to the work students at Roger Williams have done on behalf of detained scholars through our partnership with NGO Scholars at Risk. Whether it was meeting with students in his role as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Rights, and Labor in the State Department, or conducting meetings with other students in the White House while serving on the National Security Council. For over 14 years now, Scott has advised students on their work, connected students with other officials and colleagues, and when appropriate, has advanced and escalated the work of the students into the next channels within his own purview. So we're really grateful for having Scott as a friend in that position, and certainly his willingness to help work with students to advance the work that students are doing. You'll hear more about his background as we start this conversation about the U.S.'s role and obligations to global human rights, something we're talking a lot about these days. And I hope you'll develop some questions of your own to ask. But for now, please welcome Scott Busby and Dr. Roberts, who many of you I'm sure know, who will begin the questioning and then open the floor when the time is right. So welcome both.
Okay, hi, I'm Joseph Roberts. I'm the professor and chair of political science and international relations. And I thought as we would do this, we'd do it more as a conversation. And so I sent Scott a number of questions to sort of ponder, and we'll kind of start with that. And so my first one, I'll pull my little list down here. Thinking about the legal obligations for the United States under international law regarding intervention in human rights, how do we balance our obligations for human rights on a global level with our national interest?
Great. Thanks, Joseph, and thanks to all of you for coming. It's great to have such a robust turnout. Well, first of all, I think it's worth saying that effectively there are no legal obligations on a country when it comes to another country's human rights problems. Most of current international law is informed by the UN Charter and the declarations and treaties that have been formulated subsequent to the UN Charter. The UN Charter is very focused on the sovereignty that governments should enjoy. That is to say that each government should have control over the events in its own territory, and those events and that control should not be subject to the intervention of another country. So that's one fundamental principle in the UN Charter. But there is also lots of discussion in the UN Charter about human rights and about a government's commitments to protect and promote the human rights of their own people, and about the responsibility of the international community to try to ensure that all individuals enjoy their fundamental human rights. And that's reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the key authors of, which was issued right around the same time as the UN Charter. So you see this language in the UN Charter between respect for sovereignty on the one hand and respect for human rights in the other. And there's tension between those two things, which to this day has not been resolved. A lot of the debates within the US government and the debates internationally are about that tension between sovereignty on the one hand and human rights on the other. Now, in recent years, particularly in the wake of the genocide that took place in Rwanda in the 1990s and the killings and genocide that also took place in the former Yugoslavia, the international community has said, gosh, we need to do more to try to prevent these types of situations from happening again. There is something, a genocide convention, which was established after World War II, which does say that the international community should try to stop genocides where governments are aware that a genocide is taking place, but not much beyond a kind of general exhortation to do that. After Rwanda and Bosnia, members of the international community said, well, maybe we're not going to establish a legal obligation to intervene in situations where there's human rights abuses taking place in a given country, but we think there's a responsibility, more of a moral requirement that other governments do something to stop these situations from occurring. So that's kind of the landscape that we're in right now. And I'll go back to your question, it was kind of balancing national interests against those things. That's a very big question. Maybe we'll get into that in more detail as we talk about the United States. But essentially, you know, on the one hand, a country like the United States, we're founded on human rights. The Constitution reflects basic human rights. Indeed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in many respects is modeled on elements within our Constitution and within our country, as well as other countries around the world. So on the one hand, we're a country that is very much informed by our values. On the other hand, we have a lot of difficult governments in the world that we've got to deal with to advance our own interests, whether that's China, Saudi Arabia. We've just been talking about Vietnam. We can talk more about the trade-offs there. So as a country, we have often immediate short-term interests with a given government that make it difficult for us to prioritize human rights or values in our relationship with that government.
How have our foreign policy priorities changed over time, particularly as it relates to both the human rights side of things and the national interest side of things? Sometimes they overlap. More often than not, they don't.
Yes.
So how have we evolved over the last, 4 or 5 presidential administrations?
I'll go back even earlier. I mean, certainly in the wake of World War II, once we learned about the Holocaust, and of course the thousands of other abuses that took place during World War II, I would say there was increased interest in the United States in trying to do more to prevent those situations from happening in the future. But by the 1950s, that interest had sort of receded. There was something called the Bricker Amendment in the Senate, which was essentially an attempt to try to keep the United States out of all international treaties. And through the 1960s and early 70s, human rights was not really a part of the foreign policy conversation, except insofar as we felt that the US and Western democracies respected human rights and that the Soviet Union and its allies did not. So human rights was a feature of the Cold War, but not much beyond that. In the 1970s, something significant happened. Henry Kissinger, as both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, was a diplomat who believed strongly in realpolitik. Those of you who have taken international relations courses or studied Kissinger that period probably know this already. He didn't have any time really for human rights. He was interested in the balance of power among governments. He was particularly focused on thwarting the Soviet Union, which is why he and President Nixon reached out to China as a sort of counterweight to the Soviet Union. And he did not shy away from overthrowing and or challenging governments like Chile, for instance, which elected a social democratic / socialist president in the early 1970s who was maybe going to take some action vis-a-vis some of the U.S. corporations there. And the U.S. clearly played a role in overthrowing that government. And the reason for that was the feeling that a government like that in Chile is on the wrong side of the ledger. We need that government to be on our side, not on the Soviet side or between the Soviets and ourselves. And so Henry Kissinger looked at things very much in that sort of black or white sort of way, and wasn't really interested in how a government might be treating their own people. And so in situations like Chile, Argentina, South Korea, Greece, and of course in Vietnam, where the American public observed the sorts of abuses that the U.S. government had engaged in with concern. There was a reaction to all these things in the Congress and in the American public to say, that's not who we are. We care about how a government, we should care about how another government treats its people. So in the 1970s, there were a bunch of hearings held by Congress, led by a congressman from Minnesota named Don Frazier, to look into the role of human rights in U.S. foreign policy. And coming out of those hearings, Congress passed a law which said, A, we shouldn't give military assistance to any government that commits gross violations of human rights. B, the State Department should issue annual reports about human rights on every country in the world. Some of you may have seen those before. They're issued still annually. And C, we should create a bureau within the State Department dedicated to human rights. The State Department should not be only about diplomats and diplomacy. We should also have a bureau that is focused on these issues of human rights. And so since then, human rights has had more of an institutional role in American foreign policy. But that role has not always been one that has prevailed in arguments within American foreign policy, but at least it exists. And the last decade, 12 years of my career, was spent in the bureau in the State Department dedicated to trying to promote and protect human rights overseas.
How much would you say that sort of history reflects sort of short-term thinking versus long-term thinking, right? I look at it and see, in the immediate moment, maybe realpolitik matters more, but if I think for 20 years or 30 years or 50 years, the situation looks a whole lot different, and maybe today's enemy might become a worse enemy or a friend over time. So I think that's an interesting sort of thought.
Yes. So the data clearly shows that democracies, that governments are democratic and respect human rights, are better allies over the longer term. They're more stable countries, and they're more economically prosperous. And indeed, the 3 economists given the Nobel Prize last week have dedicated most of their research to proving that governments that are more inclusive and democratic, in fact, are environments where economies do better. So as an empirical matter, it is true that over the long term, democratic, rights-respecting governments are better. They're better for their people, and they're better allies for the U.S. But in the short term, you have a lot of governments that aren't rights respecting, and you got to deal with them. Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, Iran. And it is indeed those sort of short-term demands that the U.S. often has to prioritize over the longer term. So a lot of the debates within U.S. foreign policy are often between a long-term interest that is pretty much agreed should be in favor of human rights and democracy, but the short-term need to deal with a Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia has oil, or we need Saudi Arabia in terms of Middle East peace, or China, even though China is abusing rights like crazy. And you'll hear this from Johar Ilham when she comes. She's a member of the Uyghur population from China, and her father has been given a life sentence in prison because he is viewed as a threat to the Chinese regime. So as a country, we have to balance these short-term and longer-term interests, and it's not easy. One of the most compelling cases, I think, for trying to prioritize human rights, look at Iran. If we had prioritized human rights and democracy to a greater extent in our relationship with Iran before the revolution in 1979, would we have maybe ended up with a government that may have been, A, more reflective of the Iranian people's interests, and B, been friendlier to the US? Hard to know whether or not that truly would have been the case, but certainly I think there would have been less antipathy for the United States had we been on the side of human rights throughout the 1970s when the Shah was torturing and killing some of his own people.
Oh yeah. Oh, and that one goes back even to 1953.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
Mohammad Mossadegh, the coup that wasn't, or
Yes.
coup that was, depending on who you want to ask. So that I think that's a very interesting case that we can see a trajectory of increasing violations of human rights, but they were very much anti-communist, very much part of that blockade of the Soviet Union in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yes.
And then revolution happens, and now Iran is public enemy number 1 or 2, depending on who you want to ask.
Yes. Yes.
National security versus economic interests. Is one more important than the other?
Well, I mean, certainly if another government poses an imminent threat to the United States, that's going to be a top priority. But that's not often the case. So typically, national security considerations and economic considerations sort of go hand in hand as higher priorities than human rights in the short term. China being a good case in point. When I was in the State Department, I was telling Joseph I'd spent a lot of time on Vietnam and meeting with dissidents in Vietnam and protesting the political prisoners in Vietnam and trying to improve the internet freedom in Vietnam. And we were able to talk about those things and wave our fingers at the Vietnamese government, but the more senior people within the US government, including in the Biden administration, felt like we needed Vietnam to be on our side vis-a-vis China rather than the Chinese side. For those of you who track China, you know that there are all sorts of disputes within the South China Sea, with China more and more asserting its alleged sovereignty over certain parts of the South China Sea. The International Court of Justice and others basically say the Chinese have overstepped here. Vietnam has been on the wrong end of those disputes. That is, China has gotten the better of Vietnam. So rather than chastise Vietnam constantly for its human rights violations, we've made more of an effort to try to win the Vietnamese over to us. So much so that we now have what's the Biden administration calls a strategic partnership with Vietnam, despite the fact that the number of political prisoners in Vietnam has been rising in recent years. So that kind of shows the ways in which kind of national security, economic interests often trump our interest in human rights.
Is it easier to balance or the economic interest with human rights versus the national security interest?
That's a good question. Not really. I mean, I suppose national security interests are slightly more powerful than economic, but when you think about economic interests, you're talking about American companies and American workers. So in a country like China or Vietnam, you know, the health of the American economy hinges to a large extent on American businesses' ability to operate in those countries, to sell goods to those countries, and to buy goods being made in those countries. And as we all know, if the economy is stupid, that our citizens are very focused on when it comes to elections. So presidents and governments in the United States, the government in the United States, are loath to do anything that might prejudice the economic health and well-being of U.S. citizens.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of curious though as to, can we use sort of economic interests as a way to leverage more protection for human rights, i.e. we will trade more with you if you do, whereas national security, that seems harder to do, you know, an enemy or an adversary even.
Yes.
It's much more difficult to say, well, we can play off and be nice if you do better on human rights, whereas on the economic side.
No, you're right. And there are certain things in U.S. law that do require respect for rights when it comes to our trading relationship. There's a law pertaining to Africa which says that you can't grant duty-free entry to African goods from a given country if the government of that country has committed gross violations of human rights. There are other conditions on receiving those benefits as well. There's actually a debate right now in the U.S. Congress about whether a broader trade benefit scheme called the Generalized System of Preferences should also be conditioned on whether or not a government respects human rights. So you're right that there's maybe a little more room in terms of our economic relationships to insert human rights, but can't go too far. One interesting recent case that you'll hear about from Johar, who will be your next speaker, is the Congress passed something called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which prohibits the importation of any goods that have been made in the Xinjiang region of China on the grounds that we should presume that anything made in that part of China has been made with forced labor. And it's really thrown American businesses for a loop because they're now having to look into their supply chains to see whether any of the inputs or products that they are purchasing are in any way connected to Xinjiang. And Xinjiang is where a lot of the world's cotton is produced, tomatoes, solar inputs for solar panels and solar panels themselves. So there are a lot of products in the international market that have been touched in Xinjiang. And it's really created upheaval within American business to try and comply with this law. So yeah, there may be a little more room to insert human rights into economic relationships than on national security relationships.
So, good segue, incorporating human rights into policy, right? So those are some clear examples. What are some other good examples of where we have been able to very systematically incorporate human rights protections or guarantees into policy, both human right or both foreign policy, but trade and economic and commerce and finance and sort of the.
Oh, very, very good question. So I mentioned earlier that in the 1970s, Congress passed laws that created the bureau I eventually worked in, the Bureau of Human Rights, Democracy and Labor within the State Department, required the State Department to publish these annual reports on human rights, and also mandated that, that we not provide security assistance to any governments that committed a consistent pattern of gross violations of human rights. The U.S., the executive branch has been very successful in creating a bureau dedicated to these issues and in issuing these annual reports on human rights, which are a real resource for the world to evaluate the human rights behavior of other governments. We've been much less successful in the last prong of precluding security assistance to governments that engage in a consistent pattern of gross violations of human rights. Why? Because of the national security interests we have described. So as a consequence of the failure of implementing that last law or adhering to that last law, other laws were passed to try and more specifically target the particular people or units in a government's security forces that have committed human rights violations. And this was specifically done in something called the Leahy laws, named after the Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy, which says that we cannot provide assistance to any specific individual or unit within another government's security forces that's implicated in gross violations of human rights. And I would say that's more successful than the original law that said no security assistance to a government whatsoever if it's committed a consistent pattern of gross violations of human rights. So that's been fairly successful. There's also been a very successful law implemented on trafficking in persons. This was enacted 2000, I think, which requires the U.S. government to report on trafficking in persons engaged in by other governments and how well a government is addressing that problem, and then grades those governments on how they're doing. So they fall into one of three tiers of, depending on how much they are doing to try to address this problem of trafficking. And if you're in the worst tier, you get sanctioned. You essentially cannot get various types of U.S. assistance. And no government wants to be in that third tier, not only because they're prohibited from getting assistance, because it's like getting a public failing grade. No government wants to be shamed in that way. And as a consequence, a lot of governments have actually done positive things to address the issue of trafficking in persons, which is also encompasses the phenomenon of forced labor. So that's been a more successful law. And as I mentioned, there is this human rights component to trade benefits with Africa that's been fairly successful, and a few other things like that that have worked better than some of the broader mandates that Congress has passed.
Bipartisanship? Dead? Not dead?
No, you know, this is a good news story.
Yeah.
Republicans and Democrats alike fundamentally agree that human rights is an important part of U.S. foreign policy. There's slight differences in emphasis between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans, for instance, historically have focused more attention on communist governments than non-communist governments. It's changed a little bit since the end of the Cold War, but there's still more interest in focusing on the communist governments in the Republican side. There's also a lot of interest in the Republican side on religious freedom, partly because that's an important part of the important number of their constituents are really interested in that issue of religious freedom. Democrats, you know, at least in the 70s and through the 80s and 90s, tended to be more focused on the human rights behavior of our allies because they felt that that was understudied or we didn't pay enough attention to that. But in recent years, they've kind of been willing to look at everyone. It's interesting. I served under both Republican and Democratic administrations, and both of them like to say, oh, we're better on human rights than the last administration was, which shows that both Republicans and Democratic administrations believe in human rights. I mean, I would say that President Trump was the president least interested in human rights, at least in the day-to-day decisions he was making. That said, he signed an executive order that said violations of human rights are a threat to our national security, which is striking to me. So in any case, there is a degree of bipartisanship, and in the Congress, both Republicans and Democrats have supported my former bureau, both politically and in terms of the money they've appropriated to us. So it's an interesting story on that.
It's sort of the one, maybe the one, piece of good news in terms of the hyperpartisanship, that it does seem to be something they can get out behind a little bit together. Any particular foreign policy initiatives that have tried to push a human rights-based foreign policy that have been just abject failures that we wish we hadn't done?
Yeah.
Sort of the flip side?
Yeah, I mean, the second Bush administration made a big deal in its second term of the so-called Freedom Agenda, and they had a very rigorous process led by the National Security Council for evaluating the human rights behavior and respect for democratic norms of various governments around the world in terms of assistance and that sort of thing. But that was overshadowed really by the Iraq War, and everyone saw, anyway, everyone looked at the Bush Freedom Agenda and said, oh, that's about Iraq and trying to impose our will on Iraq. That was such a tainted agenda by the time the Obama administration came in, and I served in the Obama White House for the first 2 years, that we were told, don't refer to the Freedom Agenda at all, because that's anathema to a lot of the world. Biden administration talked about that democracy and human rights is at the core of our foreign policy at the beginning of the administration. Biden administration convened several summits on democracy, and we went from criticizing Saudi Arabia and MBS, Mohammed bin Sultan, for their human rights abuses, but now we're buddies with Saudi Arabia again. Same with China. We were much tougher on China, the Biden administration was early in the administration, and we've since tried to establish a stable relationship with China. So I would say that the Biden administration also can be criticized for rhetorically talking a good game on democracy and human rights, but in actuality not prioritizing those issues in as many of our relationships as the democracy community at least wanted them to.
What about the rest of the world's perspectives on U.S. initiatives to promote, our broader foreign policy agenda focusing on human rights? What's the global community's perspective on what we do well, not so well? How does this play?
Okay, so the global community, of course, is a very diverse lot with authoritarian governments and democratic governments. Authoritarian governments, when we criticize them, almost uniformly say, don't meddle in our internal affairs, and who are you to criticize us given the abuses in your own country, given the killing of George Floyd and the way in which Native Americans have been treated and the chaos of your elections. Who are you to tell us how to do our business? So that's almost uniformly what we hear from authoritarian governments. From other democratic, rights-respecting governments, they recognize that there's some inconsistency between our preaching human rights overseas and some of our domestic issues. But they also look to us, given our power, to often lead the charge on calling out the Chinas and the Russias and the other human rights abusers in the world. I would say the most interesting thing I learned over the course of my time in DRL was how much human rights activists and civil society leaders around the world value U.S. leadership. on human rights. They don't say the U.S. is perfect, and they will themselves say the U.S. Has problems of their own, but they very much appreciate the attention, the reporting that the U.S. government does on human rights. The State Department reports are hugely valued by them, and the assistance that we often provide to them, and the public statements we make on their behalf. So it's interesting, the difference in the perspective on U.S. Policy on human rights when you between talking to an authoritarian government and when you talk to the citizens under that authoritarian government.
Speaking of civil society, whether we talk civil society in the United States, NGOs, and activist organizations of various kinds, but also civil society organizations on a global level, what role do they play to influence U.S. foreign policy, to shape the trajectories that we pursue? I think that thinking about it both from the domestic side, where the impact might be far more, but also from the global side, where it's, again, sort of the public shaming part works for us too, or works against us too. So what do you think?
Civil society plays a key role in providing information. The U.S. government has a long reach, but it's not a complete or perfect reach around the world. So the U.S. government relies heavily on human rights activists and representatives of civil society, both in the U.S. but especially in other countries around the world, for information about what's going on in their society. Information about who's been imprisoned, who not, who's being discriminated against, who not. So first of all, civil society plays a key role in collecting and sharing information that the U.S. government and other governments don't have. Secondly, it's advocacy. Civil society can speak its mind about a situation in the country. So if President Biden is fist bumping with MBS in Saudi Arabia, you have members of civil society saying in the U.S., don't forget about Khashoggi, killing of Khashoggi. Who was responsible for that? Calling attention to things that the American people care about. So that voice, that voice of conscience is really, really important. Part of the background to the legislation passed in the U.S. in the 1970s came about because a pastor from the South in the U.S. Who was active in the civil rights community lived in Chile at the time that the Allende government was overthrown and the Pinochet government came in, and he heard the stories of torture and arbitrary detention and that sort of thing, and brought those stories back to the U.S., to the Congress, told those stories publicly. And when those stories are told and when the Congress hears about those sorts of stories, you can't let those situations lie. I mean, we as a people don't believe that other governments should be treating their own people in that way. So I think both the information and the advocacy that civil society can do is absolutely critical to making progress in human rights.
I'm sure Adam likes that answer. With his work in Penn and Scholars at Risk and things like that. Is there a new path that we can pursue? Is there a way to sort of change and adapt this so that we can do what we need to do from a national security and an economic interest perspective and human rights? Is there a way forward to sort of change the trajectory in some way?
Look, there are always going to be trade-offs the U.S. is going to have to make in any relationship given the demands of the moment. Interestingly, over the course of my career and looking at U.S. history around these issues, it's really the Congress and legislation that has been key to forcing the executive branch to pay more attention to human rights. Even though there are lots of people in the executive branch, at the State Department, at the White House, and other agencies who are interested in human rights, when it comes to dealing with other governments, you never want to make them unhappy, right? You never want to shame another government face to face, because you may need to ask them for something or other. So the executive branch tends to be the good cop, if you will, that may say to another government, please don't detain your people arbitrarily, etc., but doesn't really impose any consequences on that government if they do so. Whereas Congress, the legislative branch, is reflecting more the will of the American people and can be the bad cop, if you will, and pass legislation that forces the State Department to write its human rights reports, or forces the executive branch to cut off security assistance or foreign assistance if a government is abusing human rights. So I think there's more legislation that Congress could enact that could more tightly restrict the executive branch's discretion, if you will, around these issues. That said, Congress also recognizes that the executive branch, the State Department, always needs to have a little bit of flexibility, because you're dealing with a Saudi Arabia, you just can't cut off the relationship. You need to find a modus vivendi with them, because we have interests with them, and they're an important player around those interests. So you always need to provide a little bit of flexibility to your diplomats and to your executive branch, but there may be some ways that you can restrict that flexibility to some extent to try to ensure greater respect for human rights.
Any lessons we can learn from the past of what to do, what worked in the past that we can build on, or, oh my gosh, we can't do that again?
Yeah. I reflect on my own career. I spent a lot of time working on refugee issues in my career, but then on human rights. And I kind of shifted from refugees to human rights because I wanted to try to solve the underlying situations that create refugees in the first place. And what I came to learn over the course of my career is it's really hard to solve those underlying situations. I worked on Egypt during the Arab Spring. I was in the White House when Mubarak stepped down, and all the excitement of the days afterwards. Can we establish a new democratic government in Egypt? I worked on Tunisia, where also an autocrat was overthrown and democracy reigned for almost a decade. I worked on Sudan during the uprisings there that led to the ouster of their autocratic leader. I worked on Burma, which slowly was opening towards democracy until a new set of military leaders shut the door. So it's really hard for the U.S. unilaterally to change these situations. And what I've come to believe over the course of my own experience is that the most important thing we as a country can do is support the people in those societies who want to make democratic change, who want to enhance respect for human rights in those countries, because those are the people who long term are going to have greatest influence over the trajectory of their own country. So supporting those people through thick and thin, I think, is kind of the more important overall strategic priority we should have, rather than thinking we can influence immediate events. We can sometimes, cause a leader like Mubarak to step aside or contribute to his stepping aside, but we can't create an alternative future for Egypt unless Egypt has those civil society leaders, those leaders within civil society who can become the new government after an autocratic leader steps aside.
Yeah, I was in Alexandria and Cairo in July of 2011 after Mubarak steps down in January. And one of the things that struck me is the sort of more progressive sort of civil society organizations were so fragmented.
Yes.
every time they had a disagreement, they'd split again, and it just mushroomed out like popcorn. Whereas the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, they were one group, and they were tunnel vision to do one thing.
Filled the space.
And you saw it. I knew as soon as I was talking to them that this was going to fail, because the Muslim Brotherhood was going to be in a position to take over, and they were not necessarily going to do. They were going to pivot in a different direction, and it was going to not be pro-democracy, and the military government was going to come back and swoop in. And Egypt today is no different than it was under Mubarak.
It's sad to say, no, I'm very distressed about that. Long nights I spent working on that situation.
And Tunisia is equally horrific. They had a democracy for, So we have a room full of students mostly.
Yes.
What should they be doing? How do they change things? How do they prepare to have an impact on changing this for the better?
Well, educating yourselves. You have a very unique opportunity as students to spend your time reading, thinking. So you can read the human rights reports. You can take a class with Professor Roberts. You can join the Scholars at Risk chapter here at Roger Williams and learn about kind of what the human rights situations are around the world and how you might influence them. But you got human rights issues here at home too, and let's not forget those. You can work on human rights at home, whether it's anti-discrimination work, whether it's democracy work. So I think that's a unique opportunity too. And if you're really interested in international human rights, of course, getting some international experience, I think, is valuable. I was telling Joseph, I talk to a lot of young people who want to know how I ended up having the career that I had. And I share these broad thoughts with them, but I tell them one of the things they can do coming out of undergrad is join the Peace Corps. Go overseas, see what it's like. Work with folks overseas on the ground trying to make a better life for themselves and get a flavor of what that's like. Learn a foreign language. See what it's like to live in another culture. So many of the diplomats I admired within the State Department got their start in the Peace Corps. So that's one of the recommendations I give to young people who are looking to maybe get into this field.
Now I want to open it up. I've monopolized, almost an hour here. So questions from you as students. Very back.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the great presentation. I feel informed about it, about how the international foreign policy works in general. So, do you feel like this situation is ideal? Because generally this thing of one country or certain countries being the patron of human rights in other countries. Because if I'm to use an analogy, I would see it as if we have a court and the plaintiff or the defendants are part of the judging system. And that's why these problems come up of other dictators, even doing gross things in their countries, arguing that, there is problems in the United States, or arguing that the United States is furthering its own interests in trying to promote human rights, to defend it, or arguing that the United States is trying to change regime, yet trying to improve human rights. Are there discussions and efforts towards changing into something that's more directed to the United Nations? Anything that is widely and democratically driven, where all countries in the world just decide and so that there is not that conflict of interest? Is this an ideal situation, or is this a strategic advantage that the US still feels like is better for certain countries to be the patrols of human rights. Because there is also a colonial context to this, such that it's the richer countries, the Western countries that are patrolling human rights. And it's not reciprocal, because then a poorer country can't then say that they are trying to intervene in human rights in the US when George Floyd gets killed.
Yes.
So are there any discussions or advances towards something that's more like the UN? And
Yes, excellent question. So as I mentioned, human rights is very prominent in the UN Charter. I think I Googled it last night. I think it's mentioned 7 or 8 times, the importance of human rights and the importance of the international community coming together to try to defend human rights. The UN did create a commission on human rights relatively soon after the Universal Declaration, and which is now there was some reforms made in 2006, so that it's now the Human Rights Council based in Geneva. So it's an attempt to establish a UN body that objectively and neutrally tries to assess human rights situations around the world. What could be wrong with that? Well, the problem is kind of the problem in the UN generally, that you have a lot of powerful countries, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, that are not themselves very interested in respecting rights in their own countries, and that are resistant to any scrutiny to their own human rights record. And these countries are both in the UN General Assembly, they're all in the UN General Assembly. Some of them, like China and Russia, are on the UN Security Council, and some of them are on the UN Human Rights Council. So the result is you can't get the council because it's made up of governments that are imperfect. Imperfect is a too soft a word, that are themselves severe human rights violators. You can't get the council to address certain human rights situations. Case in point, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who is also a UN mechanism, which also represents a UN mechanism intended to neutrally assess human rights situations around the world, issued a very strong critical report about the treatment of Uyghurs in China, the group that Johar Ilan, who's coming to talk to you in a few weeks, is from. So they issued this report. The US proposed a resolution in the Human Rights Council to have a discussion in the council about the report. No action, just to have a public discussion. China, when it got wind of the fact that the US might be pushing this resolution, started lobbying every other member of the council saying, don't you dare agree to this resolution. This is an attack on China. This is an interference in our internal affairs. And as a result, the resolution didn't pass, and there was no discussion about China's treatment of Uyghurs in the UN Human Rights Council. So even though it would be ideal to have a neutral body in the UN as the patroller, as you described it, given the imperfect nature of the UN, given that you have UN member states that are themselves violators of the human rights, it's very difficult to do that. I would note, however, that after George Floyd's killing, a number of governments came together in the Human Rights Council and passed a resolution requiring a discussion around racial discrimination generally, globally, and racial violence. And the US did not object to that resolution and willingly engaged in a public discussion about those issues. So I would say the difference between the US and some of these authoritarian governments is that the US is willing, at least most of the time, to be open about its issues and challenges and what it's trying to do to address them, whereas governments like China, Russia, Saudi Arabia aren't willing to have an open discussion about those challenges.
Other questions?
So like thinking about countries like Afghanistan, it's just been on my mind from our cab driver in Pittsburgh. What can or what does the government in the U.S. do to prepare countries for democracy rather than maybe just trying to force it on them in like a sudden regime change?
No, that's an excellent question, and it's mostly about kind of what I was talking about, educating young leaders in those societies in the principles of democracy and the importance of democracy. Ronald Reagan actually, along with the US Congress, helped to establish a number of institutes that train political parties overseas and how to organize them and run themselves in a way that can contribute to democratic development. So I think that's the primary thing that we need to do. There have been a couple initiatives. The young, anyway, there are a group of young leaders that the U.S. brought together in Southeast Asia. We bring together them annually to kind of talk about democracy, human rights, and other issues of the day. We've done the same thing in Africa, and I think those sorts of initiatives are really critical. Bringing people to the United States to show them how democracy is or is not working in the U.S., but to try to show them what it means to live in a society where there is respect, basically, for freedom of expression, where there is, rule of law, at least to a larger extent than there is in their countries. So I think that's the kind of work that needs to be done. Unfortunately, in Afghanistan, things didn't work out, and that's another one of these depressing situations. And I can't give you chapter and verse about why U.S. policy didn't work, but it's a tragic, tragic case, and we're now trying to pick up the pieces in terms of getting people out and things of that nature.
Another one that you didn't mention, Middle East Peace Initiative, which was a State
Yes.
Department initiative
Yes.
that Roger Williams hosted 3 consecutive years.
Oh, is that right?
We hosted MEPI students on campus in the summer and, talked about civil society, talked about, democratization, but it was all young people who could then be the future wave of
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
sort of democratization movements in the Middle East, and something that my department wants to bring back and sort of have it be a regular feature of things on campus. So Emma's got her own work now. Other questions?
Or comments?
Hi, my name's Coralie. So I really liked Robert's question about how can the U.S. use its economic connections
Yes.
with other governments to kind of force them to follow certain human rights policies that
Yes.
maybe they're not following now. And my question is, how can the U.S. put this into practice? How can the U.S. use their economic ties and power to force countries to better protect human rights? And I know you had mentioned countries that we currently work with, involving national security or oil, and how it's a complex situation because there's boundaries between how far the U.S. can go in trying to change another country's government. But again, going back to my question, how can the U.S. do this? How can the U.S., because the U.S. has economic power, so how can it use its power in the world to kind of push for better human rights in countries where people are not being treated properly?
Yes. Well, I do think even though there are laws that say we shouldn't be giving aid to governments that commit a consistent pattern of gross violations of human rights, we don't always abide by that. So tightening up that requirement, why should we be giving money to a government that consistently abuses the rights of its people? In some situations, there may be, people suffering from HIV/AIDS, people who are hungry, victims of natural disaster. Okay, in those situations, we maybe have to provide assistance to those people. But we don't have to provide assistance to those governments. So tightening up those requirements, I think, is one thing. As I said, the trade, making favorable trade arrangements with other countries contingent on a country's respect for human rights, I think could be a big step forward. As I say, it is embedded in this one law relating to trade benefits for Africa. I think we should we should globalize that requirement. We should not be engaging in favorable trade deals with other governments that do engage in gross violations of human rights. So that is currently being considered in the Congress. And then, as I was saying, this Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that prohibits the importation of goods made with forced labor, we should require that goods that the U.S. government buys, goods and services, or goods and services that are made overseas have to comply with basic human rights principles and requirements before they come into the U.S. So I think this Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is a step in the right direction, and I think we can maybe expand that type of requirement and require American businesses essentially to ensure respect for human rights in their own operations.
I really like that idea too, and I'm glad you mentioned that. And I feel like this can also apply to areas like Congo, where people are being forced to work in mines and collect cobalt. So a similar practice can definitely be applied there as well.
Yes.
So using that as like a first step towards tightening up the, how should I say this? Tightening up the U.S.'s, but yeah, I'm just gonna leave it at that. Using that as a first step towards the U.S. being more involved in protecting human rights on a broader scale abroad.
Yeah, like Apple and Tesla shouldn't be able to purchase cobalt from the DRC if we know that cobalt is being produced by forced labor by children, forced child labor, right? Or child labor, period, which happens to be the case. Now, it's really hard to enforce that, but that should be the fundamental principle. We shouldn't be allowing U.S. businesses in the U.S. market to benefit from products that are made without respect for human rights.
Other questions?
In the back? Hi.
My name is Jaylene, and I was just wondering, while the U.S. is one of the more fortunate countries when it comes to like human rights advocacy, what do you think we could do about the issues within like Black and brown communities when it comes to redlining and health disparities?
Yeah, excellent question. I'm going to broaden your question because I often get it. And it's kind of about, it goes back to this allegation that often is thrown at the U.S. is like, who are you to be criticizing us for human rights abuses, given the abuses that have taken place over the course of American history? And let me just say up front that the U.S. has horrendous human rights abuses in its own history. We were a country founded on slavery. It was only white men, property holders, who initially had the vote. It took centuries for other parts of the population, be it Black and brown people, be it women. It's shocking to me to think that women didn't have the right to vote until whenever it was, 1920.
1920.
That's shocking. Half the population didn't have the right to vote. And we had, of course, the Jim Crow laws in the South. We had lynchings, hangings. So we have discrimination against Chinese workers in the late 19th century, up through, say, the George Floyd killing in recent years. So we have very significant issues in our own history. I think the things we have going for us is a free press, first of all, so that people independent of the government can investigate and report on these types of abuses. We have a fairly independent judiciary, which can issue rulings independent of the political will of the moment. We have laws that allow for freedom of expression and formation of civil society. So if you care about redlining, you can establish a group that is dedicated to investigating and advocating around an end to redlining. So we have certain features to our system that have helped us over the centuries to address some of our shortcomings. So that's kind of my broad answer. When it comes to the specific problems of the moment, that's all about, one, getting the Congress to enact new laws to address these things, although there's a lot of good anti-discrimination laws on the books. So given the existing laws, it's about the executive branch, and particularly the Department of Justice, investigating allegations of redlining and the like, publicizing them, and then taking legal action where necessary to remedy them. So, but we can't forget about the important role that people like you and organizations focused on these issues play in pressuring our government to pay attention to these things and do something about them.
I'll add one more piece. 20 days from now is an election, give or take. I have to look at the exact math, don't quote me on the math, but roughly 20 days is an election, and particularly you as young people, historically, young people don't vote as often as older Americans. And if you want to see change, in whatever direction you want to see change, go out and vote, but vote up and down. Vote for president, certainly, but also vote for Senate and Congress and your state and local government and all of this, because you are going to, if you vote in large enough numbers, you will drive the change politically that helps facilitate all of the other things, keeping the independent judiciary, keeping pressure on the Justice Department or anything like that. So if I can sort of do one more piece to put my political science hat on, please, for the love of God, go vote. Like, if you are not, if you need to go get an absentee ballot, if you need a friend to drive you wherever they need to drive you, please go vote.
Totally agree.
I think we should probably take this as the last question, just
Okay.
for time, but both of these young men will be sticking around for a little. You can stick around, you can talk with them afterwards here with the questions.
Hi, I'm Mahani. I'm majoring in international relations and economics, and thank you for coming here. My question is, how do you think USA should enforce human rights in countries that they do not cooperate with? I know you mentioned not giving them aid, but in countries, for example, like Iran, don't you think not giving them aid or like putting sanctions would just put pressure on people rather than changing a state's behavior?
Are you recommending sanctions or not recommending sanctions?
I know that you said we could not give them aid or not giving
Yes.
them money, but don't you think sanctions or
Yes.
preventing aid would just put pressure on
I
people
didn't
rather
mention
than
sanctions, and that's a very good point. there are laws in the US, something in particular called the Global Magnitsky Law, which empowers the executive branch, the Treasury Department and State Department, to impose economic sanctions on individuals engaged in gross and serious violations of human rights. And dozens of people and entities have been sanctioned under this law, including many, many individuals and entities in Iran. Now, those sanctions are only effective insofar as those individuals or entities have money in the international system that might touch the United States, right? The sanctions, if they hold money only in Iran or only doing business in Iran, those sanctions don't really reach them economically. But I still think the U.S. government thinks that publicly sanctioning these individuals still has a deterrent effect, if not on them, then on other people who might engage in those sorts of abuses. So I do think that's one way of trying to address the situation in Iran. Iran's a tough one, as we were talking about before. It's somewhat impervious, or impervious is the wrong word, certainly unwilling to cooperate with the United States and the international community around improving its human rights situation. So I think one of the most important things we can do is publicize what the human rights situation is like in Iran. The U.S. government tries to do that each year through the annual human rights reports that I talked about earlier. So I think for any government around the world, North Korea, Iran, Burma, that publicity at least is telling it like it is as to that human rights situation in that country, so that the citizens of that country and other governments around the world really know what's happening and what the U.S. thinks is happening. Beyond that, yeah, it kind of depends on the particular country and if we have any points of leverage in that country. With an Iran and North Korea or Burma, it's tough. But those are the things we need to look for to try to impose some pressure on.
I have a follow-up.
Yeah.
Because I think what you might have also been getting at is also with the sanctions on the state.
Yeah.
If it in fact is not the citizens who are getting hurt by the sanctions, perhaps in Iran, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Whether those sanctions are effective when it's the citizenry that ends up paying the price.
I see.
For the
Yeah. No, and there is often criticism of those sort of state-oriented sanctions that the U.S. Sometimes imposes on governments, and that's a tough issue. And the U.S. struggles often before imposing those sanctions. But in some cases, like Iran, I think the view of the U.S. government is there's no way of really punishing Iran for its bad behavior other than imposing those sanctions on the government as a whole or on the society as a whole, and that on balance it's better to do that even if it might have some negative consequences for the people around. There are exceptions, by the way, for those state-based sanctions for humanitarian goods. I know in Iran, for instance, there is an exception for medicine that maybe Iranian citizens can't get inside Iran. Same is true for North Korea. Yeah, but it's kind of a balancing act that the U.S. government has to do in deciding how can we most have an impact on the behavior of that government.
Well, on that, thank you both for being here. Thank all of you for coming and participating. Dean, Kevin, Kidd, and I appreciate seeing all of you in here. And again, Scott and Joseph will be around here for a little bit if you have some questions that you wanted to ask individually.
Thanks, everyone, for a good discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.